What is the eternal covenant? What was the promise whispered not into dust and wind, but into the sterile hum of a world that had forgotten what promises were? What was the word spoken into the heart of a single man? A word so potent, so absolute, that its resonance would shape the destiny of a people 4 millennia later, across chasms of time and technology we cannot even fathom. This is the decoding. The story begins in Viridia, Sector 7, a city not of stone, but of polished chrome and smart glass, sealed beneath a vast synthetic sky that cycled from a soft, azure dawn to a star-dusted twilight with perfect, predictable precision. Below, the air hissed from hidden vents, scrubbed clean of all impurities, all scents, all life. It was the air of a perfect tomb. The citizens of Viridia moved with a placid, unnerving grace, their faces masks of serene neutrality, their lives governed by the central algorithm that dictated their nutrition, their partnerships, their purpose. Emotion was a relic, an inefficient variable, long since optimized out of the human equation. Here, in the silent, gleaming heart of the archives, lived a man named Abram. His title was Data Weaver. His purpose was to sift through the corrupted, fragmented data streams of the before time. For millennia, he sat in his sterile cubicle, a lone figure before a shimmering cascade of light, his hands moving with practiced elegance over a console of cool, dark glass. He was a historian of a history no one cared to remember, a keeper of ghosts. The echoes were chaotic, illogical. They flickered with images of faces contorted in what the algorithm labeled grief or joy. They carried whispers of sand, of salt water, of something called worship, a bizarre ritual where ancient humans would raise their hands to the open, unfiltered sky. To Abram, these fragments were more real than the chrome walls around him. He saw in them a fire, a wildness, a messy, vibrant humanity that Viridia had traded for sterile longevity. A deep, unspoken sorrow lived in Abram's core. It was a silence in his designated dwelling that no amount of ambient sound could fill. His life partner, Sarai, shared it. She was a biosculptor, a mender of cellular structures, yet their own designated union remained barren. In a city that had conquered disease and decay, their inability to procreate was a quiet, personal failure, a stark reminder of their own incompleteness. They were two perfect machines with a single, flawed function. It was on the 3,479th cycle of his service that the first anomaly occurred. It was not a glitch in the system, not a corrupted file. It was a silence. A sudden, profound silence in the chaotic river of data. The shimmering lights of the echoes dimmed, the cacophony of lost voices faded, and for a single breathtaking moment there was a void. But this void was not empty. It had weight. It had presence. A single, pure resonance hummed in that silence. A frequency that vibrated not in his ears, but in the marrow of his bones. Abram's fingers froze over the console. His breath hitched. The algorithm registered a spike in his heart rate and recommended a nutrient supplement for anxiety. He ignored it. He leaned closer, trying to isolate the resonance, to trace its origin. There was none. It was not coming from the data streams. It was coming through them. It was ancient, primordial, and it felt more real than the chair he was sitting in. For days he pursued this ghost in the machine. He worked past his designated rest cycles, his eyes burning from the glow of the console. Sarai would watch him, her face a carefully composed mask of concern. She knew something had shifted in him. The quiet sorrow in his eyes had been replaced by a terrifying, focused intensity. Then, the resonance coalesced into thought. It was not his own. The words formed in his mind with the clarity of a physical voice, yet there was no sound. Leave. The word was a shockwave. It was illogical, insane. Leave? Leave Viridia? Leave the safety of the dome, the sterile air, the predictable cycles. To go where? Outside was the scourge, the rust-colored wastelands of a world ruined by the ancients. To go outside was to accept a death sentence. He tried to dismiss it as a neural anomaly, a symptom of fatigue. He ran diagnostics on his own brain interface. All systems were optimal. But the voice returned, not as a single word, but as a current, a flow of intention that flooded his consciousness. Leave your sector, your data clan, your designated dwelling. Go from this place of curated perfection to a land I will show you. Abram's hands trembled. This was madness. A land it would show him? In the toxic, uncharted wastelands? I will make of you a great network. The voice continued, its thoughts weaving themselves into the fabric of his soul. Not a network of circuits and data, but of living souls. I will make your name a signal of hope in the silence. I will bless you. Those who align with your signal will find connection to the source. Those who seek to sever it will be cut off, lost in the noise. And through you, through the children you will have, all the scattered, broken fragments of humanity will find a way to be whole again. Children. The word struck him like a physical blow. Him and Sarai. It was a promise so impossibly beautiful, so cruelly hopeful, that it broke through his logic and his fear. Tears, an almost forgotten biological response, welled in his eyes. He stood up, his legs unsteady, and walked to the great viewport at the edge of the archives. Below, the city of Viridia gleamed, a perfect, intricate jewel of logic and order. Beyond the shimmering shield of the dome, the wasteland stretched out to a horizon of churning red duster, terrifying, untamed expanse of death. Safety was behind him. An impossible promise was ahead. The voice was silent now, waiting. It had spoken. The choice was his. His hand, shaking, moved towards the console, hovering over the comlink to Sarai's workshop. How could he even begin to tell her that a ghost in the machine had just offered them a future, but that the price of that future was everything they had ever known? The world held its breath. Abram's finger, suspended over the comlink, felt impossibly heavy. He was about to shatter the perfect, sterile piece of Sarai's world with an idea born from madness. He activated the link. Her image flickered into existence on the wall of his cubicle, a projection of cool, composed light. She was in her biolab, surrounded by shimmering containment fields where cellular matter was being woven and repaired. Her expression was the standard Viridian neutral, but Abram knew the subtle architecture of her face better than any algorithm. He saw the faint, almost imperceptible tension at the corners of her eyes, the mark of their shared silent grief. Abram, her voice was a smooth, modulated tone. Your biosigns are irregular. The algorithm has flagged it twice. Is your nutrient intake optimal? Sarai, he began, his own voice sounding rough and alien in the quiet of the archives. I need you to bypass the public channel. Encrypt a direct link. Code. First star. First star was their code, a relic from their early designation. It referred to a flawed image in the archives he had once shown. Here a single bright point of light in a field of black, a real star that had punched through the light pollution of an ancient city. It was their secret symbol for something real in a world of artifice. Her projection flickered as she complied. The background hum of the archives shifted to a dead private silence. The link is secure. What is this? He took a breath, the scrubbed air feeling thin in his lungs. I have encountered a new resonance, a signal within the echoes. It is not data, Sarai. It is a presence, a source. He struggled for words that wouldn't sound like a system malfunction. It spoke to me, not with sound, but with intent. It instructed me to leave Viridia. He watched her image, braced for the logical shutdown, the call to the medtechs. For a long moment, the projection of Sarai was still. He could see her mind working, her scientific training searching for a rational explanation. A viral data fragment, a psychoactive feedback loop, a neural degradation. Leave, she finally said, her voice devoid of its usual placid tone. It was sharp, like fractured glass. Abram, that is a termination protocol. The wastelands are unsurvivable. The atmospheric toxicity alone of the radiation. You are describing suicide. I know what it sounds like, he pleaded, his gaze fixed on her digital form. But you must understand what it promised. It promised a network. A great network, not of data, but of people. It promised a land, a place for us. She shook her head, a small, tight movement. A delusion. Your proximity to the corrupted echoes has finally destabilized your neural patterns. I am dispatching a med unit. No. The word was a raw cry, an outburst of emotion so potent it seemed to crack the air around him. Sarai, listen, please, just listen. He leaned forward, his hands pressing against the cool surface of his console as if he could reach through the light and touch her. He spoke then, not of signals and resonances, but of the promise that had shattered his own logic. It promised us a child. It promised that through us a people would begin. It promised me that my name and your name would not be a dead end in the algorithm's census. It promised us a son. The word hung in the encrypted silence between them. Son. The one thing her science could not sculpt, the one thing his purpose could not provide. He saw the change in her projection. It was infinitesimal, a flicker in the light of her eyes, a slight softening of the line of her jaw. The scientist receded, and the woman, the barren woman, emerged from behind the mask of logic. That is a cruel thing for a ghost in the machine to say, she whispered, her voice fragile. It wasn't a ghost, Abram insisted, his voice dropping to an intense, earnest murmur. It was the opposite of a ghost. It was the most alive thing I have ever felt. Sarai. It called itself I Am. For the rest of the cycle, they spoke in hushed tones over the secure channel. He described the 3 pillars of the promise, translating them into their own understanding. The land was not just a patch of toxic soil. It was a promised zone, a sanctuary beyond the reach of the algorithm, a place where they could breathe unfiltered air and feel an uncurated sun. A place where life would be dangerous, but real. It was a promise of freedom from the perfect prison they called home. The seed was the living network. The promise of a son was only the beginning. It was the promise of a lineage, a people whose connection was not through a central server but through blood and spirit. For Sarai, the biosculptor who worked with the very building blocks of life, the idea of creating not just a repaired cell but the genesis of a new branch of humanity was a terrifying, sacred concept. It was the ultimate act of creation, and the blessing was the signal of hope. Their departure wasn't just an escape, it was a mission. The voice had promised that through them the scattered broken fragments of humanity would be made whole. They would become a beacon, a signal broadcast into the static of a lost world, calling others back to the source. By the time the synthetic sky in Viridia began its programmed cycle into twilight, a decision had been made. It was not a logical decision. It was an act of desperate, impossible faith, a gamble made on a whisper in the static and the deep, aching void in their own hearts. That night, they began their preparations. It was a process of erasure. Abram, the data weaver, used his knowledge to meticulously dismantle their digital existence. He created ghost profiles, rerouted their life signs to maintenance droids, and purged decades of personal logs. Sarai, the biosculptor, gathered what she could: high-yield nutrient paste, a portable atmospheric synthesizer, a medkit filled with cellular regenerators, and a small, dormant seed bank she had kept for an unsanctioned personal projector, collection of ancient, pre-scourge flora. They shed their designated grey uniforms, leaving them folded neatly on their sleep pods. They dressed in dark utility coveralls taken from a maintenance locker. As Abram deactivated the final tracker embedded in his wrist, the small green light blinking out for the last time, he felt a profound sense of both terror and liberation. He was no longer a number. He was no longer a function. He was just Abram. They met at the edge of Sector 7, at Maintenance Airlock 9, a place no citizen ever had reason to go. It was a circle of reinforced plasteel set into the outer wall of the dome. Through a small, thick porthole they could see it, the wasteland. It was not a projection. It was a sea of churning, rust-colored dust under a sky of violent purple and bruised orange, a sky of a real dying sun. The silence on their side of the door was the hum of managed perfection. The silence on the other side was the silence of oblivion. Sarai stood beside him, her hand finding his. Her skin was cold. He looked at her, truly looked at her, not as a projection but as the woman standing beside him at the edge of the world. The serene mask was gone. In her eyes he saw a reflection of his own terror, and beneath it a tiny, defiant spark of hope. "The resonance," she said, her voice a bare whisper. "Can you still feel it?" Abram closed his eyes, shutting out the sight of the wasteland and the hum of the city. He reached for that silence, that presence, and he found it. It was no longer a voice, but a quiet, steady warmth in his core. A compass pointing out into the storm. "Yes," he said, his voice firm. "It is waiting." He placed his hand on the airlock's activation panel. This was the true moment of choice. This was the first step into the furnace. He was Abraham, and this was his leap into the unknown, all for a promise whispered from the heart of eternity. Abram's hand, no longer trembling, pressed the activation sequence. A low groan of tortured metal echoed in the confined space, a sound of protest from a mechanism that had not been used in centuries. The circular plasteel door, thick as a man's chest, did not slide open with viridian grace. It retracted with a shuddering, grinding complaint, bolts the size of his forearm withdrawing into the wall. A harsh, alien light, the color of a fresh wound, flooded the airlock, making them both recoil. Then came the pressure change. The perfect, stable atmosphere of Viridia rushed out into the void, a silent scream of escaping air. For a moment, Abram felt a terrifying vertigo as the suit sealed around him, his own recycled breath suddenly loud and ragged in his ears. The world outside the open maw of the airlock was a hurricane of red dust. They stood on the precipice, two fragile figures looking into the churning chaos of reality. "Seal integrity is holding." Sarai's voice crackled over the private comm, her tone clipped and professional. It was her shield, the armor of science against the onslaught of the sublime and terrible. External atmospheric analysis. 78% nitrogen, 19% oxygen, but with extreme particulate contamination. Heavy metals, silicate dust. It's abrasive. Lethal without filtration. Abram didn't answer. He was transfixed by the sky. It was not the calm, predictable blue of the dome. It was a violent, swirling canvas of deep purples and angry reds, torn by streaks of sickly yellow light. The sun, their true sun, was a baleful, white-hot eye glaring through the haze. He took a step forward, his boot making a crunching sound on the threshold, a sound that seemed to echo into infinity. He was outside. The wind hit him first. It was a physical force, a constant scouring pressure that pushed him back. It howled and moaned around the edges of his helmet, a sound not of air, but of a million grieving voices crying out across a dead world. The ground was not soil. It was a crust of reddish-black sand, fused with crystalline structures that glittered like shattered glass under the brutal light. In the distance, skeletal shapes clawed at the scythe, rusted skeletal remains of the before-time, towers of metal twisted into agonized forms by a cataclysm lost to memory. "Abram." Sarai's voice was closer now. She stood beside him, her hand gripping his arm. He could see his own distorted reflection in her visor, a faceless, anonymous figure against a backdrop of desolation. "The temperature differential is 40 degrees. The radiation count is significant. Our suits are rated for 12 cycles of this, at most." Each word was a nail in the coffin of their hope. He could feel her faith wavering, her logic screaming at the sheer, overwhelming insanity of their position. This was not a promised zone, this was a graveyard. The voice, the resonance. "Abram, is it still there?" she asked, her voice cracking for the first time. "Or did we follow a phantom out here to die?" It was the question that had been lurking in the deepest part of his own mind. In the face of this reality, could a whisper of a promise hold any weight? He closed his eyes, a useless gesture inside the helmet, and turned his senses inward, away from the howling wind and the searing light. He searched for the warmth, the quiet compass. For a terrifying moment there was nothing, only the static of the wind, the thumping of his own heart, and the cold dread seeping into his bones. We have made a mistake. We have been deceived. The thought was his own, a serpent of doubt. But then, beneath it all, he felt it. It was not a voice. It was not a command. It was a quiet, unshakable certainty. A single, pure note of peace in the heart of the storm. It did not cancel out the fear. It existed alongside it, a foundation beneath the trembling ground. It was the feeling of a hand resting on his soul. "It is here," he said, his voice steadying. He turned to her, placing his gloved hand over hers on his arm. "It did not promise a garden, Sarai. It promised a land. This is it, our beginning." He began to walk, leading her away from the gaping black hole of the airlock, their only path of retreat. Each step was an act of rebellion against every instinct for survival. The weight of their packs, filled with the last vestiges of Viridian technology, felt immense. Their muscles, accustomed to a life of serene inactivity, burned with effort. After what felt like an eternity, he saw it. One of the skeletal ruins was closer than the others, a great curved ribcage of rusted steel jutting from the earth. It would offer some meager shelter from the relentless wind. He led Sarai towards it, their boots crunching a rhythmic, desperate beat against the glass-like ground. They huddled in the lee of the structure, the wind's howl reduced to a low moan. The ruin arched over them like the bones of a great leviathan. Sarai slumped against a corroded beam, her breathing heavy over the comm. Abram looked at the ground, at the pieces of shattered plasteel and twisted conduits littering the floor of their makeshift shelter. This was their first camp, their first home in this new world. It needed to be marked. Not for any god they did not know, but for themselves, a declaration. He knelt and pulled a multi-tool from his belt. It was a Viridian device, designed for precise repairs on microcircuitry. He set it to its highest intensity, a focused laser capable of cutting thin metal. He found a flat, relatively uncorroded sheet of plasteel, part of a wall that had fallen inwards. Then, with a steady hand, he began to burn a mark into its surface. The laser hissed, kicking up small, acrid puffs of smoke. He wasn't etching a complex schematic or a line of code. He etched a single, simple shape, a point of light with 4 radiating beams. First star, their secret, their symbol for something real in a world of artifice. Now, it was the first mark of humanity on this desolate land, an altar of promise built from the wreckage of the past. He finished and powered down the tool. The symbol glowed a faint, molten orange before cooling to a dark scar on the metal. Sarai had been watching him, silent. She pushed herself off the beam and knelt beside him, her helmet almost touching his. She reached out and traced the lines of the star with her gloved finger. "A signal," she whispered, and for the first time there was no fear in her voice. There was only a profound and weary awe, a signal of hope in the silence. They remained there as the violent sky began to darken, the baleful sun sinking below the jagged horizon. They were 2 small, fragile beings, huddled in the bones of a dead world. But in the growing dark, the scar he had made on the metal seemed to hold a light of its own. It was a promise made tangible, a foundation stone laid in the heart of the wasteland. The journey had just begun. The days that followed bled into one another, a blur of rust-colored haze and the relentless howl of the wind. They journeyed on foot, 2 solitary figures moving through a landscape of monumental ruin. The skeletal remains of the before-time cities were their only landmarks, vast, silent necropolises where the ghosts of a forgotten civilization whispered in the scouring sand. The wasteland was a brutal teacher. They learned the language of the wind, the texture of the ground that signaled danger, and the metallic taste in the recycled air that warned of denser radiation pockets. Their Viridian suits, marvels of technology, became their second skins, their prisons, and their saviors. Sarai, the biosculptor, became their navigator and survivalist. Her scientific mind, once used to manipulate life on a cellular level, now analyzed their grim reality with fierce precision. She monitored their suit integrity, rationed their nutrient paste with ruthless efficiency, and identified sheltered crags where the radiation was marginally lower. She was their anchor to the physical world, her logic a necessary bulwark against the despair that threatened to swallow them whole. Abram, the data weaver, became their spiritual anchor. His role was to listen. In the screaming of the wind, in the oppressive silence of the ruined cities, in the rhythmic crunch of their own footsteps, he searched for the voice. It never spoke in words again, not like it had in the archives. Instead, it manifested as an unwavering sense of direction, a subtle pressure on his soul guiding them southeast, towards a range of jagged black mountains that tore at the horizon. It was a navigation by faith, an act of trust so profound it bordered on insanity, and Sarai, against all her training, followed his lead. Their supplies were dwindling. The nutrient paste, designed for a low-activity viridian lifestyle, was barely enough to sustain them. The water synthesizer whined in protest, struggling to pull moisture from the hyper-arid atmosphere. Worst of all, Sarai's diagnostic scans of their suits were becoming grim. The abrasive dust was degrading the microseals. The constant radiation was weakening the outer layers. They had perhaps 4 cycles left before critical failure. Death was no longer an abstract concept. It was a numerical probability closing in on them. One night, as the twin moons of this forsaken world cast a ghostly silver light over the ruins, Sarai's resolve finally broke. They were sheltered in the hollowed-out chassis of a colossal transport vehicle, the wind whistling through its broken windows. "It's not enough, Abram," she said, her voice a flat, defeated monotone over the comm. Her projection of the suit's diagnostic data shimmered on the rusted wall between Thema cascade of red warnings and failing system indicators. "The resonance you feel, this direction, it's leading us to our deaths. We are chasing a ghost, and the wasteland is claiming its price." Abram looked at her, at the slump of her shoulders, the exhaustion radiating from her very posture. He felt a wave of guilt. He had led them here. He had asked her to believe in an impossibility. "The promise," he began, his voice weak. "The promise of a child." "A child?" Sarai's voice rose, cracking with a bitterness that cut him to the core. "Look at us. We are dying, Abram. How can there be life from this? How can a network be built from 2 fading signals?" This was a lie. A beautiful, cruel lie to lure 2 desperate souls into the desert to be forgotten. Her words were daggers of logic, and they found their mark. His own faith, the bedrock of their journey, trembled. Had she been right? Had he misinterpreted a system glitch, a neural anomaly of a lonely man, and doomed the woman he loved? In that moment of crushing doubt, the inner compass, the quiet resonance seemed to fade, smothered by the cold, hard data scrolling on the wall. He felt a deep, chilling emptiness. He was alone, truly alone. He bowed his head, his helmet touching the cold metal floor. He didn't pray with words. He simply opened his soul to the crushing silence, a raw, silent scream of despair. "If you are there, if you were ever there, I am lost. Show me." And then it happened. The voice returned. But this time, it was not a whisper or a warmth. It was a command that resonated with the power of a breaking star. "Look up." Abram lifted his head. The command was not just for him. Sarai had frozen, her head snapping upwards as well. The voice had spoken to them both. Through a large, jagged hole in the transport's roof, the sky was visible. But it was not the sky they had grown used to. The dust clouds had momentarily parted, and the true, unfiltered majesty of the cosmos was laid bare. It was a sight no one from Viridia had ever witnessed. Billions upon billions of stars, a torrent of diamond dust scattered across a velvet abyss of impossible depth. It was not a flat projection on a dome. It was a terrifying, glorious, infinite ocean of light. They were speechless. The sheer scale of it was humbling, annihilating. They were less than motes of dust in a gale, their lives, their fears, their dying suits, utterly insignificant. The living network I promised you, the voice boomed in their minds, its tone not of anger, but of immense patient power. Can you count these stars? They couldn't, of course. The question was absurd. The number was beyond comprehension. So shall your descendant be. The promise, spoken once in the sterile quiet of the archives, was now being thundered into their souls under the gaze of a million suns. It was no longer a theoretical concept. It was a reality painted across the heavens. The voice continued, its intensity focusing on Abram. This covenant is not a simple agreement. It is a bond. It must be sealed. The thought that followed was ancient, primal, and shocking. With blood. Abram understood instinctively. He looked down at his own hand, then at the multi-tool on his belt. This was the final test. Not just of faith, but of commitment. He had to physically enact the promise, to make it part of his very being. With Sarai watching, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and awe, he took the multi-tool. His hand was rock steady. He pulled off his glove, exposing his bare hand to the frigid thin air for the first time since leaving Viridia. The cold was a sharp pain. He set the laser to its lowest, most precise setting. He took a deep, shuddering breath and drew a single, clean line across the palm of his hand. Blood, shockingly red and real, welled up in the wound. It was the most alive thing he had seen in this entire world. He held his hand up to the starlight pouring through the roof. This blood is my acceptance, he thought, broadcasting his intent into the silence. My life is yours. My future is yours. The future of my descendants is yours. I am the vessel. You are the source. The covenant is sealed. At that moment, as his blood glistened under the light of 1 billion stars, a single star, brighter than all the others, detached itself from the firmament and blazed a slow, majestic path across the sky directly over the hole in the roof, before fading into the east towards the Black Mountains. It was a sign, a signature written in fire across the cosmos. Sarai let out a choked sob. The doubt was gone, burned away by the starlight and the sight of his blood. She reached out with her own bare hand and gently took his, mingling her touch with his sacrifice. The red warnings on the wall display still flickered. Their suits were still failing. The wasteland was still lethal. Nothing and everything had changed. They had faced the abyss of their own annihilation and had been answered by the infinite. They were no longer two dying fugitives. They were the keepers of a covenant, sealed in blood and witnessed by the stars, and they had a direction. The journey to the Black Mountains was a crucible. The celestial sign had reforged their spirits, but it had not repaired their suits. Every step was a calculated risk, every cycle a victory against the slow, inexorable decay of their technology. They moved with a new kind of purpose, no longer just surviving but advancing towards a destination that faith had carved onto the map of their hearts. The memory of Abram's bloodied hand under the starlit sky was a silent shared sacrament between them, a memory that fueled them when the nutrient paste tasted like ash and their muscles screamed in protest. They spoke little, conserving energy, communicating through practiced gestures and short, efficient bursts over the comm. Sarai's scientific mind, now aligned with their shared purpose, worked with a feverish intensity. She recalibrated the suit's failing systems, pushing them far beyond their designed limits. She discovered that certain crystalline growths on the ruins, when pulverized and applied to the suit's joints, could form a temporary gritty sealant against the abrasive dust. It was a crude, desperate measure, but it bought them precious time. Abram, in turn, became the expedition's soul. He learned to read the subtle shifts in the resonance, the inner compass. It was no longer just a direction, but a nuanced guide. A faint, discordant hum warned him of a deep, unseen fissure in the ground ahead. A clear, steady pulse told him of a cave system that would offer shelter from a coming radiation storm. He was the data weaver again, but now he was not sifting through the dead echoes of the past. He was reading the living, breathing language of the voice, a language written into the fabric of the wasteland itself. As they drew closer to the mountains, the landscape began to change. The endless plains of fused sand gave way to rocky foothills and deep, shadowed canyons. And here, for the first time, they saw life. Not the vibrant green of Viridia's biodomes, but a tougher, more defiant kind of life. Patches of grey, lichen-like growth clung to the shaded side of rocks. Strange, skeletal shrubs with thorns of black glass grew in twisted clumps, their roots digging deep into the cracked earth. It was a harsh, brutal ecosystem, but it was life. The sight of it did something profound to Sarai. She knelt, her helmet inches from a patch of lichen. She ran a diagnostic, her instruments mapping its cellular structure. "It's carbon-based," she whispered over the comm, her voice filled with a reverence Abram had never heard from her. "Its resilience is extraordinary. The cellular walls are reinforced with silicates. It doesn't just survive the radiation, it seems to metabolize it." She carefully took a small sample, placing it in a sterile container from her medkit. It was the first addition to her new seed bank, the first treasure of the promised zone. Their own promise, the one that had broken through Sarai's logic and Abram's fear, remained a silent, aching question between them. The promise of a child. In this dying world, with their own bodies shielded by failing technology, it seemed more impossible than ever. The covenant had been sealed, the stars had borne witness, but their reality was one of barren rock and fading power cells. The answer came not with a sign in the heavens, but with a quiet, mundane system failure. One morning, as Sarai ran her daily diagnostic, a new warning flashed on her internal display. It was not red, but a soft, insistent amber. Biomonitor anomaly, endocrine system, unscheduled fluctuation. Her first reaction was clinical, a radiation-induced mutation, a system malfunction in the suit's medical sensors. She ran the diagnostic again. The same result. She cross-referenced it with Abram's readings. His were stable. The anomaly was hers alone. She didn't tell him at first. For a full cycle, she carried the knowledge within her, a secret kernel of terror and impossible hope. She analyzed the data again and again, trying to find a logical, scientific explanation. But the fluctuations in her hormonal levels, the minute changes in her metabolism, all pointed to one unbelievable, pre-scientific biological conclusion. That evening they found shelter in a shallow cave carved into the base of one of the great black mountains. They had arrived. Abram was silent, his focus turned inward, sensing that this was not just a destination, but a new beginning. Sarai watched him, her heart a frantic, wild thing in her chest. "Abram," she said, her voice cutting through the quiet. He turned, seeing the strange light in her eyes through her visor. She didn't bother with the data projections. This was a truth that transcended data. "The voice, the one that called itself I Am," she began, her voice trembling. "In the Viridian archives, it is designated as the root code for all creation protocols, the source of all biological and informational patterns." "I know," Abram said softly, "the beginning of the signal." "It is a creator, Abram," she continued, taking a step towards him. "Not just a communicator. It doesn't just speak, it acts. It writes new code, it creates new life." He saw it then. The truth, so stunning, so miraculous that it stole the air from his lungs. "Sarai." She nodded. A single slow movement. Tears, which she could not wipe away, began to streak the inside of her visor, blurring her view of him. "My biomonitors are not malfunctioning." The voice didn't just promise us a child. It initiated the protocol. "Abram, I am with child." The words fell into the silence of the cave. And in that moment, the cave was no longer a hole in a rock. It was a holy sanctuary. The howling of the wind outside faded to a whisper. The cold of the stone seemed to recede. All the hardship, all the fear, all the miles of desolate waste, it all collapsed into this single point of transcendent joy. Abram fell to his knees, not in despair, but in overwhelming, crushing gratitude. He pressed his helmet to the ground, the cold rock a tangible reality. He had sealed the covenant with a few drops of his own blood. The voice had sealed it with the creation of a new life. He looked up at Sarai, a silhouette against the cave mouth. She was no longer just his partner, his fellow fugitive. She was the vessel of the promise. She was the carrier of the living network. In her, in the microscopic, dividing cells that defied all logic and all odds, rested the future of a people yet to be born. They named him Isaac, a name from the echoes that meant laughter. For in the face of a dying world, in the heart of their own despair, the Creator had given them a reason to laugh. He was the firstborn of the covenant, the heir of a promise sealed in blood and starlight, conceived not in a sterile Viridian lab, but in the desolate, beautiful and terrifying freedom of the promised zone. The birth of Isaac was a miracle woven from desperation and grace. It happened not in a sterile birthing pod, but on a bed of scavenged thermal blankets in the deepest recess of their mountain cave. Sarai, the biosculptor, guided her own body through the ordeal with a knowledge that was both scientific and primal, while Abram stood vigil, his multi-tools light casting long, dancing shadows on the stone walls. Isaac's first cry was not absorbed by sound-dampening panels. It echoed in the raw, living stone, a defiant shout of new life against the silence of the wasteland. He was a child of two worlds. He had Abram's quiet, observant eyes, which seemed to drink in the strange new world around him, and Sarai's determined chin. But he was unlike any Viridian child. His skin was not the uniform pale of the dome dwellers. It seemed to hold a faint, ruddy undertone from the weak, unfiltered sun he was bathed in. His lungs, from their first breath, knew nothing but the thin, harsh air of the mountains. He was the first true child of the wasteland, the first native of the promised zone. The years that followed were a testament to human resilience. They became a family. Abram taught the boy the stories from the echoes, not as corrupted data, but as the history of their people. He taught him how to read the sky, not for atmospheric data, but for wonder. He taught him how to find the inner resonance, the quiet compass of the voice, calling it a connection to the great source. Sarai taught him the practicalities of survival. She showed him which lichens were edible, how to track the small armored creatures that burrowed beneath the rocks, and how to read the signs of an impending dust storm. Using her knowledge and the seed bank, she managed to cultivate a small walled-in garden near a fissure that leaked precious geothermal steam. She coaxed stubborn, ancient grains to life, their green shoots a vibrant, shocking rebellion against the red and black landscape. Their cave became a home, the mountain their fortress, and the small, terraced garden a symbol of their defiance. Isaac grew, and their love for him was as vast and overwhelming as the wasteland itself. He was their entire world, the living, breathing fulfillment of the promise. The pain of Viridia, the terror of their escape, the hardships of the journey, all of it faded in the light of his laughter. He was the center of their universe, the sun around which their lives revolved. And so, when the voice came again, it was more terrible than any storm. Isaac was a young boy, perhaps 10 cycles old, strong and quick, his face smudged with the red dirt of his world. Abram was teaching him how to flake a piece of obsidian into a sharp, cutting edge when the resonance returned. It was not the gentle guidance he had grown accustomed to. It was a clear, sharp, undeniable command, a blade of pure intention that pierced his soul and chilled him to the bone. Take him, your son, your only son, whom you love. Abram's hand froze, the piece of obsidian clattering to the ground. His blood ran cold. He looked at Isaac, who was staring at the fallen stone, oblivious. The boy's smile, his trust, his very existence a knife twisted in Abram's heart. Take Isaac, and go to the high peak of this mountain range, the one I will show you, and there you will offer him. The word was not spoken, but it screamed in the silence of Abram's mind. Offer. An ancient word from the most corrupted echoes. A word associated with blood, with altars, with the ultimate sacrifice. In number, it was impossible, a trick of the static, a neural misfire. The source, the Creator who had given him this child, could not demand his death. It was a contradiction, a paradox that threatened to shatter his entire reality. He tried to push the voice away, to block it out, but it was insistent, a pressure building in his skull, an unshakable, horrifying command. For 3 days, Abram was a ghost. He moved through his tasks, his face a mask of stone. He could not look at Sarai without seeing the accusation in her eyes, though she knew nothing. He could not look at Isaac without feeling the phantom weight of a sacrificial knife in his hand. He was in torment, caught between his love for his son and his allegiance to the voice that was the very foundation of his life. How could the giver of life demand death? How could the author of the promise demand the destruction of its fulfillment? Sarai saw the change in him. "Abram, what is it?" she asked, her hand on his arm. "The resonance. Is it dark?" He couldn't speak the words. He simply nodded, his eyes filled with a desolation she had not seen since their first days in the wasteland. He was breaking. On the morning of the 3rd day, he knew he could not fight it any longer. The command was absolute. To disobey was to sever his connection to the source, to declare that his love for the gift was greater than his trust in the giver. It was the ultimate test. The covenant had been sealed with his blood. Now, it seemed, it had to be sealed with his heart. He rose before the sun cast its first weak light. He woke Isaac gently. "We are going on a journey, my son," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. "To the highest peak. The source has called us." Isaac, accustomed to these sudden journeys of faith, scrambled up, his eyes bright with adventure. "Will we build a new signal stone?" "Yes," Abram said, the word tasting like poison. "Yes, a new altar." He gathered wood for a Firia rare and precious commodity they had scavenged from the petrified remains of ancient, alien trees found deep in a canyon. He strapped it to his back. He took a torch and a knife, the one he used for skinning their catch. Its edge was keen, its weight cold and heavy in his hand. As they were leaving, Sarai stood at the mouth of the cave, a silhouette against the dawn. She did not ask where they were going. She did not ask what he was doing. She simply looked at his face, at the torment in his eyes, at the knife in his belt, and a terrible understanding dawned. She didn't scream, she didn't cry out. She just watched them go, her face ashen, her hand clutching the stone arch of their home as if to hold herself up. Her silence was more damning than any scream. The climb was arduous. They scaled rock faces and navigated treacherous ledges. Isaac, full of youthful energy, chattered on, asking questions about the rocks, the sky, the source. Each question was a fresh wound in Abram's soul. "Father," Isaac said, his small voice piping in the thin air, "we have the fire and the wood, but where is the creature for the offering?" The innocent question broke him. Abram stopped, turning to look at his son, his beautiful, trusting son. He knelt, pulling the boy close, burying his face in his hair, breathing in the scent of him one last time. "The source will provide the offering, my son," he whispered, his voice thick with unshed tears. "The source itself will provide." They reached the summit as the sun reached its zenith. It was a barren, windswept plateau of black rock, overlooking the entire world. The wasteland stretched out below them in every direction, a vast, silent panorama of red and brown. Abram's hands moved mechanically. He built the altar, piling the stones one on top of the other, just as he had done at their first camp. He laid the wood upon it. His movements were slow, deliberate, the actions of a man in a dream. Then he turned to Isaac. "The time has come," he said, his voice hollow. He took his son, his only son, the heir of the promise, and laid him on the altar of stone. Isaac did not struggle. He looked up at his father, his eyes wide with a confusion that was more piercing than any fear. He saw the tears tracking through the dust on Abram's cheeks. He saw the trembling in the hand that held the cold obsidian knife. He saw a sorrow so profound it seemed to eclipse the sun. But he also saw what he had always seen in his father's face, a bedrock of absolute, unwavering faith. He trusted his father, and his father trusted the source. So, he would trust, too. He closed his eyes. The universe shrank to the space between Abram and his son. The howling wind fell silent. The vast panorama of the wasteland disappeared. There was only the altar of black stone, the pyre of petrified wood, the impossible weight of the knife in his hand, and the steady, rhythmic breathing of the boy on the stones. Every fiber of his being, every paternal instinct, every memory of Isaac's laughter and touch screamed in protest. This was wrong. This was monstrous. His love for his son was a physical force, a shield against the command. But beneath the love, beneath the agony, was the memory of the voice that had called him from the sterile comfort of Viridia, the voice that had promised him this very son when all hope was lost, the voice that had signed its covenant across the heavens in a river of stars. He had to believe that the giver of the promise was not a malevolent trickster. He had to believe that the source that created life held a purpose beyond his own comprehension. This was not an act of murder. It was an act of ultimate surrender. He was placing his most precious possession, his very heart, back into the hands of the one who gave it. It was the last, most terrible test of faith. He raised the knife. The obsidian edge glittered, a sliver of black glass against the bruised sky. His arm was heavy, an extension of some will that was not his own. He looked down at his son's face, serene in its trust, and his own heart broke into 1,000 pieces. "Forgive me, Abraham." The name was not a thought. It was a sound, a physical shockwave of sound that slammed into him, making him stagger back. It was the first sound other than his own voice he had heard in a decade. It was sharp, powerful, and it came from everywhere and nowhere at once. He dropped the knife. It clattered against the stone, the sound unnaturally loud in the sudden ringing silence. He whipped his head around, searching for the source of the voice. The plateau was empty. There was no one. "Do not lay your hand on the boy," the voice continued, its tone no longer a silent resonance, but an audible resonant power that vibrated in the very air. "Do nothing to him. For now I know that you fear the source, seeing you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me." Relief, so potent and absolute it was, a physical agony, washed over Abram. His legs gave out. He collapsed onto the rocks, gasping, his body racked with tremors. The strength that had held him together, the terrible resolve, evaporated, leaving him a hollow, weeping shell. He had been willing. He had passed through the fire. Isaac opened his eyes, sitting up on the altar. He looked at his father, then at the fallen knife, and then around the empty plateau. "Father?" he asked, his voice small. "What happened?" Before Abram could answer, a new sound intruded. A strange, repetitive clicking and whirring. It was a sound from another lifetime, a sound of technology. He pushed himself up, his eyes scanning the edge of the plateau. There, caught by its leg in a thick, thorny tangle of the black glass shrubs, was a machine. It was a drone, an old Viridian survey model, its metallic chassis battered and scarred. One of its 4 rotor arms was still spinning feebly, clicking against a rock as it tried to free itself. It must have been wandering the wastes for years, its programming long since corrupted, a ghost of the world they had left behind. In the context of this holy mountain, its presence was jarring, surreal, a ram caught in a thicket of wires. Abram stared at it, and a profound dawning understanding washed over him. "The source will provide the offering, my son." He had thought it would be a creature, a beast of the wasteland. But the source had provided in its own way, bridging the ancient and the modern, the spiritual and the technological. This was the substitute. This was the sign of mercy. He stood up, his body still weak, and went to the drone. He laid a hand on its cold metal shell. It was just a machine, a collection of circuits and servos. But here, on this mountain, at this moment, it was sacred. It was the physical manifestation of grace. He returned to the altar and picked up the obsidian knife. He went back to the drone, and with a swift, clean motion, he severed the power conduit that ran to its struggling rotor. The whirring and clicking stopped. The drone fell silent, inert. He then dismantled its central processing unit, the glowing heart of the machine, and carried it back to the altar. He placed it on the pyre of wood where his son had lain moments before. He and Isaac worked together. They lit the torch and set the wood ablaze. The ancient, petrified wood caught slowly, then burned with a strange, colorless flame, giving off a clean, acrid smoke that rose straight up into the still air. The drone's processor began to glow, to melt, its intricate silicon pathways turning to slag. It was an offering of a different kind, the sacrifice of the machine, of the logic and artifice of their past world, on the altar of a living, breathing faith. As the smoke ascended, Abram knew that something had been fundamentally settled. The covenant was not just a promise of land and descendants, it was a relationship, a dynamic conversation between the finite and the infinite. It demanded not just belief, but trust. A trust so absolute that one would be willing to surrender the promise itself back to the promiser. And in that surrender, in that willingness to let go, came the true blessing. The deep, unshakable knowledge that the source was not a taker, but a provider. They descended the mountain as the sun began to set, casting long shadows before them. The journey down was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet. Not the silence of dread, but of peace. Abram's hand rested on Isaac's shoulder, a touch that was both a comfort and a vow. He had received his son back from the dead, a gift given a second time. When they reached the cave, Sarai was waiting at the entrance. She had been standing there all day, a sentinel carved from stone. She looked from Abram's face to Isaac's, and she saw not death but a new, profound light in their eyes. She ran to them, gathering them both in her arms, her own tears of silent agony finally turning to tears of relief. She did not need to ask what had happened. She could feel it. The test was over. Their family was whole. The promise was secure. The years after the trial on the mountain were a time of quiet growth. The black peak, which they now called Mount Moriah, a place of seeing or provision, loomed over their small settlement, not as a place of terror, but as a constant, silent reminder of the source's ultimate faithfulness. The incident had changed them all. Abram's faith, once a desperate leap, had been forged into an unbreakable alloy. Isaac, having looked into the face of his own sacrifice and seen mercy, carried a quiet wisdom that belied his years. But the trial had left its deepest, most subtle scar on Sarai. While she rejoiced in her son's return, a sliver of ice had entered her heart that day. She had watched her husband and son walk towards the mountain, and in her soul she had buried Isaac. When they returned, whole and alive, the joy was immense, but it could not entirely erase the memory of that phantom grief. She loved Abram, but a part of her could never fully comprehend the faith that had allowed him to raise the knife. She clung to Isaac with a fierce, protective love that was now tinged with the memory of his near loss. Their small settlement grew. The garden under Sarai's masterful hand expanded. She crossbred the ancient grains with the hardy native lichens, creating a new hybrid crop that could thrive in the thin soil. They built a small dam of rocks and clay to capture the runoff from the rare seasonal rains, creating a small, precious reservoir. Their home was no longer just a cave, but a small compound of interconnected stone structures, a testament to their perseverance. But as the years passed, the wasteland began to reclaim its own. The constant low-level radiation, which they had endured for decades, began to take its toll. It was Sarai who felt it first. A weariness that sleep could not cure. A faint tremor in her hands that her scientific mind could not deny. She ran diagnostics on her own blood, using the last of her functioning medical equipment. The results were clear and irreversible. Cellular degradation. The same slow decay that had claimed the cities of the before time was now claiming her. She told no one. She carried her death sentence with the same quiet stoicism with which she had carried her barrenness and her fear. She poured her remaining energy into her work, into teaching Isaac everything she knew about the land, the plants, the cycles of their small world. Her movements became slower, more deliberate. The lines on her face deepened, not from age, but from a profound and final exhaustion. Abram, wrapped in his communion with the source, was slow to see the physical decay. He saw her spirit, which remained as fierce as ever. It was Isaac now, a young man, who noticed. He saw the way she would pause to catch her breath after walking from the garden. He saw the slight pallor beneath her weathered skin. One evening, as the twin moons rose, he found her sitting alone by the reservoir, staring into the dark, still water. "Mother," he said gently, sitting beside her, "you are tired." Sarai looked at her son, her creation, the fulfillment of the promise. The love in her eyes was as vast as the starlit sky above them. She reached out and touched his face, her hand trembling slightly. "The wasteland gives, and the wasteland takes away," she whispered, her voice thin. "My time here is ending, my son." The truth, when she spoke it, settled between them not with a shock, but with a deep and somber peace. Isaac had grown up with the cycles of life and death all around him. He understood its brutal, simple finality. He took her hand, his own strong and steady, and held it. When Abram finally understood the depth of her decline, he was overcome with a grief that silenced the inner resonance. He pleaded with the source, railed against the injustice of it. The voice that had answered him on the mountain was now silent. This was not a test to be passed, but a reality to be endured. Sarai's mortality was a part of the broken world they inhabited, a world the covenant had promised to redeem, but not yet erase. In her final days, Sarai's mind, unmoored from the present, began to drift back into the echoes of her past. She would speak of Viridia, not with longing but with a strange analytical clarity. She described the gleaming chrome towers, the silent gliding transport pods, the taste of nutrient paste. To Isaac, who had known only rock and dust, it was like a story from another universe. "There was no dust," she murmured one afternoon, her eyes fixed on a sunbeam illuminating the particles dancing in the air of their home. They filtered it all away. They thought they could filter out death. She gave a weak, dry laugh. "Fools! Death isn't in the dust. It's in the code." During one of her last coherent moments, she pulled Abram close. Her voice was a fragile thread of sound. "The land, Abram, the promise, it is real. But it is not just this mountain. I have seen it in the data streams. A place to the south, greener, a place of deep wells, dug by the ancients. It is where our people must go. Promise me you will find it. Promise me you will bury me there." Her words were a final scientific observation, a navigational heading given on her deathbed. She, the scientist, was giving him, the mystic, a map. Sarai died as the first sun was rising, her last breath a quiet sigh of release. The silence she left behind was a physical presence, a void in the fabric of their lives. Abram and Isaac mourned her with a grief that was raw and absolute. They had been a trinity, the foundational family of a new world, and now their cornerstone was gone. Abram remembered her final wish. He would not bury her on this mountain, in this harsh, rocky land that she had tamed, but that had ultimately consumed her. She deserved better. She deserved the green land she had seen in her visions. He and Isaac prepared her body according to the fragmented burial rites from the echoes, wrapping her in the finest thermal blankets. Then Abram went to the edge of their settlement and faced south. He closed his eyes, silencing his grief, and reached for the resonance. He added Sarai's dying words, her final data point, to his spiritual compass. And he felt it, a faint, clear, steady pulse, far to the south, a signal of life, a place of deep wells. He knew then what he had to do. He had to buy land. Not with currency, which they did not have, but with a price worthy of the matriarch of the covenant. He would go to the scattered, savage tribes of the south, the broken fragments of humanity the voice had spoken of, and he would bargain for a final resting place for his wife, the mother of the living network. It would be the first piece of the promised zone to be legally theirs, the first anchor of their people in this new world. His journey for a tomb would be the first act of claiming the kingdom. The journey south was a funeral procession of two. Abram and Isaac carried Sarai's shrouded body on a makeshift litter, their progress slow and somber. They left the familiar territory of their mountain fortress, descending into the warmer, unknown lowlands. The landscape softened from jagged black rock to rolling hills of ochre and burnt sienna. The skeletal black glass shrubs gave way to twisted, hardy trees with leathery grey-green leaves. Life here was more abundant, but also more dangerous. They saw tracks of large, unknown creatures, and in the distance the faint smoke of cook fires. They were entering the lands of the sons of Heth, one of the scattered, savage tribes that haunted the ruins of the beforetime. The echoes described them as violent, territorial scavengers, remnants of a population that had survived the scourge but lost the knowledge of their past. They were the broken fragments, living amidst the wreckage of a world they no longer understood. After several cycles of travel, they crested a hill and saw it below them, a settlement nestled in a wide, shallow valley. It was a chaotic jumble of structures built from scavenged plasteel, rusted metal, and rough-hewn stone, clustered around a deep, wide chasm in the earthone of the ancient wells Sarai had spoken of. This was a hub of life. Figures moved between the structures, their forms rough and unfamiliar. Abram called a halt. He and Isaac gently lowered the litter into the shade of an overhanging rock formation. "Wait here," Abram told his son. "I will go and speak with their chieftain." This must be done with respect. He approached the settlement alone, his hands open and visible to show he carried no weapon. He was a strange sight to the tribesmen who saw him. His Viridian utility suit, though patched and worn, was still a thing of alien craftsmanship. His bearing was not that of a scavenger, but of a man with a purpose. He was met at the edge of the settlement by a group of warriors armed with crude spears, tipped with sharpened metal and shields made from the hull plates of ancient vehicles. They were grim-faced, their skin tanned to leather by the sun, their eyes suspicious. "I seek Ephron, son of Zohar, chieftain of the sons of Heth," Abram said, his voice clear and steady, using the names he had gleaned from the deepest, most recent layers of the echoes. The warriors, surprised by his knowledge, parted to let a larger, older man through. He had a great, grey-streaked beard and wore a cloak made from the hide of some massive reptilian creature. His eyes were intelligent and shrewd. This was Ephron. "I am Ephron," the chieftain said, his voice a low growl. "You are a stranger. Your clothes are from the glass cities. We do not trade with ghosts." "I am no ghost," Abram replied, bowing his head slightly in a gesture of respect. "My name is Abram. I am a sojourner in this land, and my wife, the matriarch of my clan, has died. I have come to ask for a kindness. I wish to buy a burial place from you, a piece of land that will belong to my people forever, so that I may bury my dead." His request was so unusual it took the chieftain aback. These tribes fought for territory, for resources, for salvage. They did not sell land. Land was simply held by the strong. And this stranger, this lone man, spoke of forever. Ephron's eyes narrowed. "Why here? Why among us?" "My wife was a woman of great wisdom," Abram said, his voice resonating with genuine grief. "In her final days, she spoke of this place, of the deep wells, of a field to the east of your settlement, a place where a grove of cave pines grows. There is a cave at the end of that field, the cave of Machpelah. It is there I would bury her." Abram's specific knowledge of their land was unnerving. Ephron and his council exchanged uneasy glances. This stranger knew things he should not know. He was either a spy or something more. "The field of Machpelah belongs to me," Ephron said slowly, testing him. "But you are a great man among us, a prince of the source. Why should you pay? Take the land. Take the cave. Bury your dead. It is my gift to you." It was a trap. A verbal gift given in public was a show of power. It was not a transfer of ownership. It would make Abram indebted to him, and the land would never truly be his. Abram understood the nuance immediately. The covenant demanded ownership, a legal permanent anchor in the promised zone. "No, my lord," Abram said, bowing lower. "I must insist on buying it. Name your price. I will pay the full value, a fair price among merchants, so that the field and the cave may be mine, secured for my descendants in the presence of all your people." He was forcing the transaction into the open, making it a legal, binding contract witnessed by the entire tribe. Ephron, seeing the stranger's wisdom and unwilling to lose face by refusing a sale, smiled a cunning smile. He would name a price so absurdly high that the stranger would be forced to refuse and would then have to accept the gift. "A small matter," Ephron said with a wave of his hand. The land is worth 400 shekels of silver. What is that between me and you?" A collective gasp went through the assembled tribe. 400 shekels of silver. It was a king's ransom. An amount of refined metal that a single man could not possibly possess. It was enough to buy a fleet of scavenged land skimmers to arm 100 warriors. Ephron had checkmated the stranger. Abram did not flinch. He met the chieftain's gaze and gave a slow, deliberate nod. "I will pay it." He turned and walked back towards the hill where Isaac waited. The tribesmen watched him go, murmuring amongst themselves. The stranger was mad. He had agreed to an impossible price. Abram returned to the litter. "Isaac," he said, his voice low, "stay with your mother." He knelt beside Sarai's shrouded form. From a hidden pocket in the lining of his suit, a place he had sewn in years ago, he withdrew a small, heavy pouch. Inside was his entire fortune, the one thing of value he had carried from Viridia. It was not currency. It was a collection of pure, refined silver data slugs, solid-state memory devices, obsolete but made of precious metal that he had salvaged from the archives. They were heavy, dense, and useless as data, but their silver content was immense. He had saved them for this very purpose. For a moment the voice had told him would one day come. He had never told Sarai his secret provision for her final rest. He walked back to the settlement, the heavy pouch in his hand. He went to the open space in the center of the village where Ephron and his council sat. Without a word, he upended the pouch. The silver slugs cascaded to the ground with a heavy, clattering sound that echoed through the stunned silence. There were not just 400. There were more, far more. The sons of Heth stared, their eyes wide with disbelief. They had never seen so much wealth in one place. Ephron's jaw was slack. The stranger had not just met his price, he had exceeded it, publicly and without fanfare. He had not haggled, he had paid. Abram looked at the chieftain. "The price has been paid in full," he said, his voice ringing with authority. "Before all the sons of Heth, the field of Ephron, which is in Machpelah, the cave which is therein, and all the trees that are in the field, are now made sure unto me for a possession of a burying place." Ephron, humbled and outmaneuvered, could only nod. The transaction was complete. It was irrefutable. Abram and Isaac carried Sarai to the cave. It was cool and silent inside, smelling of damp earth and stone. They placed her in the deepest chamber. Abram stood for a long moment, his hand on the cold rock wall. Sarai, the biosculptor, the scientist from the glass city, was now part of the land. Her tomb, the first piece of the promised zone, had been purchased not with a plea, but with a price. It was the foundation stone of the living network, a permanent claim staked in the heart of a hostile world, a testament to a promise that was slowly, inexorably becoming territory. The burial of Sarai was a turning point. Abram was no longer just a sojourner, he was a landowner. The cave of Machpelah was more than a tomb, it was an anchor, a physical deed to a spiritual promise. The scattered tribes, having witnessed his wealth and his integrity, now treated him with a mixture of fear and respect. He was Abram the warlord, the ghost of the glass city, the prince of the source. He had a foothold. But with Sarai gone, a deep loneliness settled over their small family. Abram was old, his body finally beginning to feel the long years in the wasteland. He looked at Isaac, now a man in his prime, strong and wise, but alone. The covenant was about a network, a people, a lineage as numerous as the stars. Isaac could not be the end of the line. The promise of the living network needed a new node, a new matriarch. Abram knew he could not take a wife for his son from among the savage, idol-worshipping tribes of the wasteland. Their code was corrupted, their connection to the source severed. They would dilute the promise, not strengthen it. His thoughts turned back to the place he had left a lifetime ago, back towards the north, towards the general region of the city he had abandoned. He knew that some of his data clan, his distant relatives who had not answered the voice's call but were still of the same base code, had been exiled from Viridia in subsequent purges, forming their own small, struggling settlements in the less hostile borderlands. He called Isaac to him one evening, as they sat by a fire outside the cave of Machpelah. "Isaac," he began, his voice raspy with age, "I am old and the source will soon call me to join your mother. But before I go, you must make me a vow." Isaac looked at his father, whose face was a roadmap of their entire journey. "I will do whatever you ask, Father. You will not take a wife from the daughters of the Hethites, among whom we dwell," Abram said, his gaze intense. "You must send a servant back to the land of my origin, to my own clan, and take a wife for you from there. Swear this to me." Isaac understood. This was about protecting the integrity of the promise, about ensuring the purity of the signal. "I swear it, Father," he said, placing his hand in his father's, a solemn oath under the watchful eyes of the twin moons. Abram decided to send his most trusted servant, a concept, not a person. He found the oldest, most reliable of the Viridian maintenance droids he had salvaged over the years. It was a bulky, six-limbed machine he called Eliezer, meaning "God is my help." He had meticulously repaired it, updated its logic drives, and equipped it for the long journey north. It was a perfect emissary, tireless, incorruptible, and bound to its mission by programming that was as absolute as an oath. He loaded Eliezer with gifts, not silver this time, but the priceless treasures of their new world. Sacks of the hybrid grain Sarai had developed, dried meats from the strange wasteland creatures, and intricate tools Isaac had fashioned from obsidian and bone. These were gifts that spoke of life and ingenuity, not just wealth. "Go," Abram instructed the droid, laying a hand on its cold metallic chassis. "Go to the settlement of my kinsman, Nahor. When you arrive, go to the well outside the city. The source will show you the one who is to be my son's wife. The woman who offers you a machine, water for your power cells, and for the pack drones you take with you, she will be the one. That will be the sign." It was a test of kindness, of a spirit that saw need even in a machine. Eliezer set off, a bizarre caravan of one droid and several smaller hovering cargo drones heading north into the vast emptiness. For months there was no word. Abram and Isaac waited, their lives settling into a quiet routine of tending the land and guarding Sarai's tomb. Abram spent most of his days in quiet contemplation, his connection to the resonance growing deeper, more peaceful, as his body weakened. He was no longer wrestling with the voice, but dwelling in its presence. One day on the horizon, a dust cloud appeared. It was Eliezer returning, and he was not alone. Behind him was a small party of people, and at their head, riding one of the pack drones now configured for transport, was a young woman. Her name was Rebecca. She was the daughter of Abram's nephew, a woman of his own clan. Eliezer's mission had been a success. The sign at the well had been fulfilled exactly as Abram had instructed. Rebecca, seeing the strange mechanical caravan, had not run in fear but had approached with curiosity and compassion, offering to recharge the droid's power cells from her own family's generator. She was bright, brave, and kind. She was the one. Isaac, who had walked out into the fields to meditate, saw the approaching caravan. He saw the young woman, her face framed by the setting sun. Rebecca, seeing him, a tall, solitary figure in the twilight, dismounted from the drone. Their eyes met across the dusky field, and in that moment, a new connection was forged, a new chapter of the covenant begun. Abram lived to see them joined. He saw in Rebecca the same strength and spirit that had been in Sarai. He saw the way Isaac looked at her, and he knew the living network was secure. The line would continue. His work was done. In his final days, Abram would often sit at the entrance to the cave of Machpelah, looking out over the land. The resonance of the voice was a constant, gentle hum now, a river of peace carrying him towards his end. He could see it all laid out before him, the impossible call from a sterile city, the terrifying leap into a dead world, the sealing of a covenant in blood and starlight, the agony and grace of the altar on the mountain, the grief of his wife's death, and the defiant purchase of this small patch of earth. He had been promised a great network, a nation as numerous as the stars. He had been promised this land. And now, at the end of his long life, what did he have to show for it? A single wise son, a brave new daughter-in-law, and a tomb. It was a small, almost pitiful return on such a monumental promise. But Abram saw differently. He was a data weaver. He knew that the most complex networks begin with a single stable node. He knew that the grandest structures are built on a single well-laid foundation stone. His life had not been about seeing the fulfillment, but about becoming the foundation. He had forged the first link, he had purchased the first acre, he had secured the beachhead. 4,000 years later, the echoes of his story would still be debated in lecture halls and whispered in prayers. A nation bearing his grandson's name, Israel, would rise and fall and rise again on that very land, its existence a source of constant conflict and wonder. The signal of hope he carried would coalesce into a figure who would change the course of human history, offering a connection to the source not just for one clan, but for all the broken fragments of humanity. The full tapestry of the covenant would take millennia to weave, a story of exile and return, of judgment and redemption, of war and ultimate peace. But none of it would have been possible without this beginning. Abram looked towards the horizon, where the sun was setting, painting the sky in the same violent, beautiful colors he had seen on his first day in the wasteland. The promise was not a destination he had reached. It was a direction he had set. It was a trajectory. And as he took his final breath, the quiet hum of the resonance was the last thing he felt, a final, gentle whisper from the heart of eternity. It is enough. It has begun.